Well, good evening, little masters, and welcome to episode 275 of the Prancing Pony podcast, where, at times, some co-host will lift up his clear voice in stirring song.
I'm not sure anyone's feeling their heart leap at any of our renditions.
No, that's fair.
But folks,
sadly,
pull up a bench in the common room and join us. I'm James Tauber, the Sage of the South, and I'm here with the man of the West who's still trying to understand slow, sonorous speech, Alan Sisto.
You know, maybe it's just a pacing thing. Just need to take a breath.
Take a leaf out of Treebeard's book, maybe.
There you go. Not so hasty. Folks, it's time to visit the lovely mountain valley of Harrowdale with Mary, Théoden, and the rest in the first of 3 episodes on the Muster of Rohan, the 3rd chapter in The Return of the King, and very different from the mayonnaise of Rohan, which you don't want to leave out.
True. You heard it here first.
Kind of left you speechless on that one, James. Sorry.
You did. That's quite all right. Folks, some of you are hearing this show for the very first time. To you, I'm sorry. No. To you.
That's fair. That is entirely fair. Yes.
But seriously, we bid you a warm welcome. Here at the Prancing Pony podcast, we are reading, talking, and, as you can tell, often joking, our way through Middle-earth, a few pages at a time.
Now, we take a deep dive into the lore, we explore how the story came to be, talk about our favorite themes, and a lot more.
But in a lighthearted and fun way, like friends chatting at the pub. And we're glad you've joined us.
And I'm sure you'll be glad you joined as well. But before we get to tonight's chapter discussion, it's time for my old friend, none other than the Lord of the Mark himself, Sean Marchese, to pay us a visit for fan favorite Philology Faire. Sean, what do you have for us tonight?
I have sore feet because I just danced into that tune.
On the table, is it a rather vigorous dance?
Absolutely, yes. It's always a vigorous dance when I'm around.
Very short.
But
short and vigorous.
Yes, totally.
We're just going to leave that right there, folks.
That's me, short and vigorous. But hey, thanks for having me back on. And folks, today we see those mysterious statues carved in the likeness of men, cross-legged with their stumpy arms folded on fat bellies, which also sounds like me sometimes. Those statues the Rohirrim called Pukelmen. Now, because that name, Pukelmen, is a name given to the statues by the Rohirrim, we might assume that name has its roots in Old English. And that assumption would be absolutely correct.
I'm surprised.
I'm sure you are. So in the nomenclature, Tolkien explains the name like this. It represents Old English pukel, still surviving as puckle, one of the forms of the puk stem, P-U-K, widespread in England, Wales, Ireland, Norway, and Iceland, referring to a devil or a minor sprite such as Puck, and often applied to ugly, misshapen persons. And if you look at the nomenclature in your Lord of the Rings: A Reader's Companion, you'll see that the Old English word that Tolkien derived the name from is actually spelled with a C, P-U-C-E-L.
Interesting. Well, the authors of Ring of Words explain that Tolkien changed the C to a K in order to avoid mistaken pronunciation. That's because in modern English, of course, C is typically soft, pronounced like the S, before front vowels like E or I. Tolkien apparently wanted to make sure his readers pronounced it Pukelmen, not Pusselmen. Pusselmen.
I can't imagine why.
I can't imagine why either. Pusselmen, yeah.
Yes, the Pusselmen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's take a look at some of the modern forms of this puk stem that Tolkien talks about so that we can get a little better sense of how this word survived from Old English into modern English.
Okay.
So, puckle, which Tolkien mentions in his nomenclature entry, well, I've never heard that word before, but it is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a malevolent spirit or demon, a bugbear or bogey, now historical and rare, which explains why I've never heard it before, because while I am myself historical and rare, I don't know a lot of historical and rare words.
No.
There's only 3 attested references of that word in the Oxford English Dictionary. So yeah.
Well, then you may be forgiven for never having heard the word. There's
Exactly.
only 3 times it
I would hope
appears
so.
ever.
Right. The earliest of those references of the word puckle is in a 1584 text called The Discovery of Witchcraft by a Reginald Scott, where it's mentioned in a list of mythical monsters like fire drakes, hobgoblins, and something called the Hellwain.
Oh my goodness, the Hellwain. That sounds Actually, it sounds like a rock festival I'd want to attend, but might be a little afraid to. Sunday. Halloween at the Coliseum.
It sounds like the nickname of that kid that was really into heavy metal. Like his name was Wayne, but everybody called him L. Wayne. Yeah.
Also, by the way, since there are 3 attested references, I do not forgive you for never having heard the word puckle, because clearly you didn't read The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584.
I know. I should have, and then I would know
it's
all about
on your
the
to-read
Hellwing
list.
Yeah, right. It's on my bedside table.
That's right. I just haven't gotten to it.
Just waiting, a little casual reading, 16th century book about witchcraft. Why not? Because that's what I do.
Actually, it probably is, but go ahead.
Soon as I can find it.
Mm-hmm.
My A books order hasn't come in yet.
There you go.
All right. So that's the earliest attested appearance of puckle. The latest attested appearance of the word in the Oxford English Dictionary was in 1944. So again, historical and rare at this point, but referring to a type of monster or evil spirit. Now, of course, the other modern derivative that Tolkien mentions is a little bit more familiar, and that's the name Puck.
Of course. Now Puck is well known to Shakespeare fans and poor unfortunate high school students everywhere as another name for Robin Goodfellow, a trickster fairy in the court of Oberon and Titania in the comedic play A Midsummer Night's Dream. But Shakespeare, as is so often the case, didn't invent the character. There are references to Puck figures with similar names in Celtic and Germanic folklore long before Shakespeare's time. And even the name Robin Goodfellow appears in 1528, almost 70 years before Shakespeare wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream.
That's right. And the OED tells us that the name Puck is probably cognate with an old Icelandic name Puki, P-U-K-I, which means mischievous demon or the devil, and other Scandinavian words for evil spirits. And similarly, there's an old Celtic word puka, P-U-C-A, in the old Celtic folklore for these types of spirits, though scholars aren't totally sure. They're kind of divided on whether the Celts borrowed the idea and the name from the Germanic tribes or vice versa. Either way, these pucks or pukas or pukir in folklore were nasty creatures. They're mischievous or wicked or even downright evil. So it's kind of a mystery why the most famous Puck of English literature, still a trickster, but not quite evil, how did he end up with a name like Robin Goodfellow? Doesn't sound like a Puck would be a good fellow at all.
No.
Well, most likely this is an example of a kind of a euphemistic name, kind of like the folklore practice of calling fairies the good folk or the people of peace.
Right. I mean, people would refer to these creatures by friendly names because if you weren't friendly about them, you might end up being the target of their next prank, their next trick, or maybe a curse on your livestock or something like that. One might say that the names these creatures were called by were often a lot friendlier than the creatures themselves.
Yeah. And a lot friendlier than most of the names that elves give to humans in Tolkien's Legendarium. The sickly and the usurpers and the heavy-handed.
Oh, my goodness, yeah. The aftercomers, yeah.
It's like, thanks a lot, guys. Just keep on twisting.
Pile it on, man.
Yep. Now, it's safe to say that we don't hear too many other references to pucks these days that don't involve Shakespeare.
Or hockey.
True. That's a different kind of puck, but that's true.
Sorry, threw you off there.
But we might if we read Rudyard Kipling, whose 1906 book Puck of Pook's Hill is a collection of fantastical short stories set in various periods of English history. And that's another one that I actually do have on my list to read. I just haven't read it yet. It's been on there for some time.
So it's after the discovery of witchcraft or before?
I think I'll read it before the discovery of witchcraft.
Probably
I feel like I might need to ease into the
16th century
to 16th century
literature.
Folklore, witchcraft, and demons.
Fair enough. Well, we're going to learn more about the Pukelmen in The Lord of the Rings soon, but it is really interesting to see that the folklore creatures that inspired Tolkien here were seriously bad news. Now, fortunately, the Middle-earth people that are called the Pukelmen by the Rohirrim are nowhere near bad news, as we'll find out in a couple of chapters.
And the Rohirrim will find out too. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
So will Sauron's forces, actually.
That's right. Yes, they will. That's right. There'll be bad news for Sauron's forces. How about that?
Yes, it will. Well, thank you for that, Sean. And thank you for stopping by the Common Room once more.
Thanks, Alan.
It is always good to hear from Sean, and I'm glad he shed some more light on Pukelmen. For now, though, it's time to get back into the text. After all, with the holidays and our special episodes, it's been a month. So, James, would you start us out tonight?
Absolutely. Book 5, Chapter 3, The Muster of Rohan. Now all roads were running together to the east to meet the coming of war and the onset of the shadow. And even as Pippin stood at the great gate of the city and saw the Prince of Dol Amroth ride in with his banners, the King of Rohan came down out of the hills. Day was waning. In the last rays of the sun, the riders cast long pointed shadows that went on before them. Darkness had already crept beneath the murmuring fir woods that clothed the steep mountain sides. The king rode now slowly at the end of the day. Presently, the path turned round a huge bare shoulder of rock and plunged into the gloom of soft sighing trees. Down, down they went, in a long winding file. When at last they came to the bottom of the gorge, they found that evening had fallen in the deep places. The sun was gone. Twilight lay upon the waterfalls. All day, far below them, a leaping stream had run down from the high pass behind, cleaving its narrow way between pine-clad walls, and now through a stony gate it flowed out and passed into a wider vale. The riders followed it, and suddenly Harrowdale lay before them, loud with the noise of waters in the evening. There the white snowbourn, joined by the lesser stream, went rushing, fuming on the stones, down to Edoras and the green hills and the plains. Away to the right, at the head of the great dale, the mighty Starkhorn loomed up above, its vast buttresses swathed in cloud, but its jagged peak, clothed in everlasting snow, gleamed far above the world, blue-shadowed upon the east, red-stained by the sunset in the west.
Oh man, that's a vivid description. That is beautiful. You can see that.
Yeah.
Oh, really, really stunning stuff. Let's go back to the beginning of the chapter. Tolkien brings us back to the action first with Théoden by starting with a summary, right? Everybody's path is heading to the east in order to face this war that's coming.
Yeah, and we get the specific observation that the two events are happening at the same time. And Tolkien often does this at the start of a chapter. He'll just have one or two sentences that remind us what's going on simultaneously, letting us know whether it's happening at the same time or we've had a jump in time and so on. And we see it here, that this is going on
Super helpful.
At the same time as Pippin is watching the Prince of Dol Amroth ride into Minas Tirith. That's the same time that Théoden is coming down into Harrowdale from the hills.
That's right, which means, of course, it is the evening of March 9th. And though I am virtually certain that we covered all of this in a more detailed Meanwhile Elsewhere in Middle-earth intro segment at some point, it's worth taking a minute or two to give you a brief reminder of what else is exactly happening at this point. Like the text says, Pippin is watching the soldiers arrive in Minas Tirith. Earlier, he'd been watching the evacuees flee the city. Probably a good point for me to say that I think I'd call them refugees in those episodes when I was working with Sean Gunner. Should have called them evacuees, my bad. The other thing that's happening, Aragorn, along with the Rangers, Elladan, El-Rohir, and a large gathering of restless dead Oathbreakers, left Erech this morning, and they are going to reach Calembil on Kirill shortly.
And at the same time, Faramir is at Caer Andros, but will leave to race back to the city as darkness descends.
Right.
And of course, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum are making their way to the crossroads, and at the moment are taking refuge in a large oak tree for the night.
That's right. The holm oak, if I remember correctly, the crotch of a large holm oak. Not sleeping. I mean, Gollum's sleeping, but Frodo and Sam are not. Yeah. So the day is nearly over, right? I mean, the riders, as they're coming into the valley, have these very long shadows, and the forests, like you'd see in these steep valleys, they're already dark.
Yeah, they head down steeply in a single file into this narrow canyon. It's steep enough that in the gorge, it's already evening.
Yeah. And you've seen that kind of thing, right? I mean, if you've been up in the mountains, you're in between a couple of very tall mountains. It may be half an hour before sunset, before the sun goes below the horizon, but it's long gone below the mountains that are above you.
Yeah, because all you can see is straight up where the sky is dark, and it doesn't matter how light it still is by the horizon. It's a lot darker straight up ahead, and that's all you can see when you're down in the gorge that steep.
Yeah. So, of course, this is Harrowdale, and we get a bit of a description here. You get first the River Snowbourn, fed by various tributaries, including the one that they've just come along by. And that runs the length of this valley, and it is a north-south valley. So imagine a north-south valley. We've come into it from the west side heading east. And that's kind of the lay of the land right there.
Yeah, so at its south end, so to the right as you're coming in from the west, is Starkhorn.
Uh-huh.
And in the north end, where the valley joins the plains of Rohan, is, of course, the city of Edoras.
Exactly. But we're going to go and add a little more detail that we find later in the chapter. In a couple of weeks, we're going to read about these two little villages in Harrowdale, little hamlets, really, Under Harrow and Upbourne.
Now, Under Harrow is, not surprisingly, in the valley below Dun Harrow.
Under Harrow.
Yeah. And Upbourne is just down the road a bit. The name reflects, of course, the fact that it's up the river Snowbourne. That's closer to the source.
Right, up the river from, let's say, Edoras, even though it's down the river from Under Harrow.
Right.
Exactly. So Tolkien tells us in his unfinished index that the Snowbourne is a river rising under Starkhorn and flowing out down to Harrowdale and so past Edoras to join Entwash in Fenmarch. So, yeah.
And while the Starkhorn is mentioned here, there are other peaks surrounding Harrowdale that we'll see later. Near the north end of the valley is Irinsaga, and between Irinsaga on the north and Starkhorn at the south is the haunted mountain itself, the Dwimorberg.
Ah, yes, where the grim grinning ghosts come out to socialize. Yeah, the haunted mountain. It is so hard not to just say haunted mansion.
Yes,
if you've ever been to Disneyland, I mean, I suppose for some, it's
I did say mountain, right? I didn't say
you did. I'm the one who keeps wanting to say at the south is the haunted mansion over in New Orleans Square, right across from the good ship sailing Columbia there. So, yeah, if you've hit Splash Mountain, you've gone too far.
Okay.
Starkhorn is not Splash Mountain, clearly. It does strike me, Harrowdale, as this really beautiful alpine sort of mountain valley. A little intimidating, though, with the height of these peaks and the darkness. Yeah. And maybe the fact that, we're all about to die. That's probably part of the intimidation factor. All right. Well, lots more to read about and talk about after we come back from the break. Now, before we get back to the text and Mary's take on all this, we want to make sure you know that even after you've listened to the episode, there is a lot more talk going on at the Prancing Pony Podcast.
The PPP has an amazing listener community. They're always coming up with great questions and discussions across all our social media spaces. Check out our common room on Facebook, our dedicated subreddit, Twitter, and more.
Now, on Facebook, just look for the Prancing Pony Podcast. Follow the page to get the news, but be sure to join the group for some great discussions.
Or, if you prefer Reddit, find us there at r/prancingponypod. On Twitter and Instagram, we're simply at prancingponypod.
And please be sure to check out the Rings of Power Wrap-Up. Now, that's my new podcast with Sarah Brown and some guy named James Tauber, where we discuss, analyze, and speculate all about Amazon's television adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth.
Alan, Sarah, and I take deep dives into the lore behind the show, or the lore that should be behind the show, talk about themes and characters, and interview folks involved with the show. So look for the Rings of Power Wrap-Up and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And check at Rings Wrap-Up on social media for more.
And folks, if you enjoy this show, please do consider supporting us by joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. So when you do, you get a lot. You get a really active Discord community that includes live episode recordings, postscripts, episodes without the digital ads, and a lot more.
Like free merch and live Discord hangouts. But you also can become part of our Questions After Nightfall episodes, or even join us as a guest in the North Wing. So please, go to patreon.com/prancingponypod to show your support and join the Fellowship of the Podcast.
Of course, you can also help us out by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify. And please recommend us to your friends.
So let's go ahead and get back to the text. Alan, can you pick up as we start looking at all this from Mary's perspective?
Absolutely, James. So picking up exactly where you left off, Mary looked out in wonder upon this strange country, of which he had heard many tales upon their long road. It was a skyless world, in which his eye, through dim gulfs of shadowy air, saw only ever-mounting slopes, great walls of stone behind great walls, and frowning precipices wreathed with mist. He sat for a moment, half dreaming, listening to the noise of water, the whisper of dark trees, the crack of stone, and the vast waiting silence that brooded behind all sound. He loved mountains, or he had loved the thought of them marching on the edge of stories brought from far away, but now he was borne down by the insupportable weight of Middle-earth. He longed to shut out the immensity in a quiet room by a fire. He was very tired, for though they had ridden slowly, they had ridden with very little rest. Hour after hour, for nearly 3 weary days, he had jogged up and down, over passes and through long dales, and across many streams. Sometimes, where the way was broader, he had ridden at the king's side, not noticing that many of the riders smiled to see the two together, the hobbit on his little shaggy gray pony, and the Lord of Rohan on his great white horse. Then he had talked to Théoden, telling him about his home and the doings of the Shire folk, or listening in turn to tales of the Mark and its mighty men of old. But most of the time, especially on this last day, Merry had ridden by himself just behind the king, saying nothing, and trying to understand the slow, sonorous speech of Rohan that he heard the men behind him using. It was a language in which there seemed to be many words that he knew, though spoken more richly and strongly than in the Shire. Yet he could not piece the words together. At times, some rider would lift up his clear voice in stirring song, and Merry felt his heart leap, though he did not know what it was about. Lovely.
Amazing. Now that we as readers have gotten the lay of the land and a reminder of when and where we are, the narrative switches to Merry's perspective.
Yeah, as it often does, right? We've talked about the epistemic regime before, the idea that we're often going to see the perspective of the person who knows the least.
And that's actually something that I was going to say that Mike Drought talked about in a wonderful talk that he gave at Carnegie Mellon, I think back in 2014, this idea that...
Yeah, it was a while back.
It was, but it was a hugely influential talk for me. It was actually how I discovered there was a thing such as Tolkien studies, and that led to me discovering Signum, in fact. So very significant.
Life-changing.
Yeah, life-changing. It really was a life-changing talk for me. And one of the major points that he makes is the way in which Tolkien focalizes, is the term, on a particular character that knows the least.
Yes.
Whether it's, in this case, Merry or Gimli or whoever it is, it's a way of him presenting information about the world and what's going on in a way that isn't forced, avoiding that problem you sometimes get in like science fiction, as you know, Bob, problem where you have to have exposition that if the characters in the scene know it and it's only being told for the benefit of the readers. But Tolkien avoids that by this always having this sort of focalization on the character that knows the least.
I love it.
In this case, Merry.
Yeah, we were just actually discussing that, Don and I, in the last chapter, because so much of the Paths of the Dead are seen through the eyes of Gimli for that exact same reason. And, Aragorn certainly has more knowledge. Legolas, he doesn't give anything about the dead spirits of men. But, Gimli gives us a chance to know less and to feel that terror.
Right.
And here we get to feel, kind of the sense of overwhelming, the pressure of things coming down on him. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So he's heard about this land. He's heard about Harrowdale from folks on the ride, probably even Théoden himself, huh?
Yeah, and he sees huge forests and even bigger peaks. This great line, great walls behind great walls.
I love that phrase. Yeah, when you've been in one of these valleys, I mean, that's exactly what it feels like, is just wall upon wall upon wall, all the way up to as high as you can possibly imagine. But we get this brief moment where it's not just the visual things, it's the auditory things. We get to hear what Merry is hearing, the noise of water, the whispering of the trees, the crack of stone, and a brooding silence. And this is just another one of these ways, and there are a lot of them in the text, where Tolkien conveys sensory experiences in a way that is incredibly vivid. And he's able to do it whether it's describing sounds or describing sights or describing smells or other sensations. It's pretty amazing stuff. And this is a real brief but very clear example of that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful example. And we discovered that while Merry thought he loved mountains, these particular mountains, not so much. Right? It's one thing for mountains to be at the edge of stories, right?
Right.
But here they're pressing down on him, looming over him, intimidating and heavy.
Yeah, a little claustrophobic.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, he wants to retreat to a quiet room by a fire in order to get away from the sheer scale of things. This is a place beyond his imaginings. Hillsides in the Shire weren't like this. Even the mountains on the horizon didn't look like this. But when you get up into them, they do, and it's more than he's really comfortable taking. Part of this, I think, is that he's really tired, right? I mean, and the text tells us that. He's been riding for 3 days. Now, yeah, they've not ridden that quickly, but they've also not stopped for rest.
Yeah. And I mean, it was a 3-day ride up and over mountain passes, through valleys, across rivers.
Yeah.
And in the chronology, Tolkien explains that they traveled slowly by hidden path in lower mountains, doing only about 35 miles per day.
That does sound slow. I mean, even if they slept for 12 hours, well, not sleeping for 12 hours, but let's assume setting up camp, sleeping for 8, and then breaking camp. So if they rested for 12 hours out of the day and then marched for 12, that means their pace is only about 3 miles an hour, which frankly is human walking pace. I think you and I might even have been able to keep up on foot.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Although with the terrain being what it is,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And really, how much more quickly could they have gone given that terrain? Remember, they're trying to be secretive here.
Yeah. Back to the text, sometimes Merry got to ride at Théoden's side, much to the pleasure of the king's men. And I love that juxtaposition of the king of Rohan, this halfling riding alongside him.
I know, the king on his massive war steed, and
exactly.
Merry on a little shaggy gray pony.
Shaggy gray pony. I love that contrast. When they did ride side by side, he talked about the Shire and its people, or listen to stories of Rohan and its heroes.
So he probably knows all about Helm Hammerhand now.
Yes.
Don't get in a fight with that guy. Yeah. But, often Merry had ridden by himself and ended up listening to the men speaking in the tongue of Rohan, which is described, and I love this alliteration, as slow, sonorous speech. Just a beautiful phrase. And interestingly, he recognized a few words, didn't he? It seemed to be many words he knew.
Yeah, but they sounded slightly different. They were richer, stronger, and he couldn't put the words all together.
Yeah.
But when one of them broke into song, it had a powerful emotional impact.
Very different than when you and I break into song.
Yes. Well, I think we do get a powerful emotional impact.
Yeah.
It's just negative.
Kind of a visceral. Not the impact we're looking for. Yeah, that's a fair point. So let's talk about this for a second, a brief sidebar on the language. How did Merry recognize some of the words? Let's go to Appendix F, Section 1. This is the languages and peoples of the Third Age. And the second part of that is called Of Men. And there we read this. Most of the men of the northern regions of the Westlands were descended from the Edain of the First Age, or from their close kin. Their languages were therefore related to the Adunaic. And as a side note, that's the Númenórean language. And some still preserved a likeness to the common speech. Of this kind were the peoples of the upper vales of Anduin, the Beornings and the woodmen of western Mirkwood, and further north and east, the men of the Long Lake and of Dale. But that's not all, is it, James?
No, Tolkien continues, from the lands between the Gladden and the Carrock came the folk that were known in Gondor as the Rohirrim, masters of horses. They still spoke their ancestral tongue, and gave new names in it to nearly all the places in their new country. And they called themselves the Eorlings, or men of the Riddermark.
Now, where was all this again? Oh yes, the upper vales of Anduin. Well, where is the only other time we read that phrase? If you search for the upper vales of Anduin in your digital Tolkien project, James, you're going to find it in one other place. And where is that? It's in the prologue in Concerning Hobbits, and that's where we read that Hobbits' earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. So they were in the same area. That explains a lot of that linguistic commonality, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And later in Appendix F, in Section 2 on translation, we get some more information that connects the Hobbit tongue to that of Rohan. In explaining that the word hobbit is simply an invention, Tolkien writes that the folk of the Shire and of Bree used the word Kuduk, which was not found elsewhere. Meriadoc, however, records that the king of Rohan used the word Kuddukan, or hole dweller. And since it's been noted the hobbits had once spoken a language closely related to that of the Rohirrim, it seems likely that Kuduk was a worn-down form of Kuddukan.
Okay. And that's a very good example of a word that Mary might have recognized, right? So Théoden or one of the other Rohirrim talks about Kuddukan. And he goes, oh, that sounds really familiar. It sounds a little like Kuduk.
Exactly.
Okay. Right. So it's that kind of thing. It's not the same word, but it's similar and it's richer and it's fuller. And the Shire tongue, the words that are still from their old days, have been really combined, I guess, with a lot of the common speech and would have changed by now, would have morphed a little bit and become a little less the way they were in the past. So in this part that we didn't read, by the way, despite his recognition of words, despite his heart being stirred by song and his getting to ride by the king, Merry's described sadly as lonely, especially now at the end of the day. And his thoughts go first to Pippin. Where had he got to?
And of course, what would become of the three hunters?
Yeah.
But then he thought of Frodo and Sam, and he actually chastises himself for thinking of them last.
Yeah, well, you can be forgiven for that, Mary. Of course you're going to think of your best friend first.
Yeah. But he's, figuring they're hundreds of miles away at this point, even if they're even still alive.
And thankfully, of course, they are. They are hundreds of miles away, some 400 plus miles away in the forests of Ithilien.
Of course, he doesn't know that.
No.
And we as readers, one of the things that I love that Tolkien does by splitting up this story into the multiple books is we get that sense of uncertainty. We go for an entire book, entire of book 5, not knowing what's going on with Frodo and Sam, wondering, getting some of the same concerns, I think, that Mary is feeling now. Are they even still alive?
Yeah. I mean, we may know they're alive now, but only if we've taken careful notes.
Yes.
And the time will come where we don't know because the stories overlap. When you read book 4 and then you read book 5, there's moving forward and moving backward. And you end up in a situation where this story, book 5, will end much later than book 4 ended.
Yes.
And so you won't know what's going on with Frodo and Sam. So, well, now that they're in Harrowdale, I think Éomer and Théoden have a little chat. Why don't you read that for us, James?
Absolutely. Harrowdale at last, said Éomer. Our journey is almost at an end. They halted. The paths out of the narrow gorge fell steeply. Only a glimpse, as though through a tall window, could be seen of the great valley in the gloaming below. A single small light could be seen twinkling by the river. This journey is over, maybe, said Théoden, but I have far yet to go. 2 nights ago the moon was full, and in the morning I shall ride to Edoras, to the gathering of the mark. But if you would take my counsel, said Éomer in a low voice, you would then return hither until the war is over, lost or won. Théoden smiled. Nay, my son, for so I will call you. Speak not the soft words of worm-tongue in my old ears. He drew himself up and looked back at the long line of his men, fading into the dusk behind. Long years and a space of days, it seems, since I rode west. But never will I lean on a staff again. If the war is lost, what good will be my hiding in the hills? And if it is won, what grief will it be, even if I fall, spending my last strength? But we will leave this now. Tonight I will lie in the hold of Dunharrow. One evening of peace at least is left us. Let us ride on.
Oh, love this little chat. It's so good. It's almost too short. I do wish it went on a little bit longer, but thank you for giving us a good reading of that one. Éomer announces their arrival in Harrowdale, right? The trip is almost at an end, but they didn't point out the obvious. Dude, that's just the first step of the journey, right? I mean, there is a long way to go. Tomorrow I go out of the valley up to Edoras, gather the forces of the mark, and even then, still a lot more to do.
Yeah. But referencing what he'd said earlier about the date on which the muster would happen, 2 nights ago the moon was full, matches up with what Éomer told Aragorn in the last chapter, where he said, before the night of the 3rd day from now we should come to the hold. The moon will then be 2 nights past his full, and the muster that the king commanded will be held the day after.
Exactly. But a real brief observation. Some of you may have texts that read, last night the moon was full. Hammond and Skull explain a little bit about that. They say that it is a shadow of an earlier chronology when Théoden arrived on the evening of the 8th of March. And Christopher Tolkien himself notes the discord in The War of the Rings. So it really is 2 nights ago. Just take notes.
Yep.
Or get a newer text.
So Éomer gives Théoden some advice. Once we've gathered the riders, you should return here to Harrowdale and wait out the results of the war.
Right. I mean, Éomer knows this is going to be a hard-fought battle. He wants his king to still be alive, but Théoden's having none of it.
Yeah, we get this lovingly tender moment. Nay, my son, for so I will call you.
Oh, I love that. Remember, folks, if you didn't already know this, Éomer was only 11 when his father Éamund was killed by orcs, and his mother died shortly after that. So he and Éowyn, who was only 7 at that time, the two of them were adopted by Théoden as young kids. So, yeah.
We're also given a reminder that those words, stay home, avoid danger, were also the words of Wormtongue, although with very different motivation
Well,
in
yeah.
that case.
Yeah, very, very different motivations for sure. But, you know, from Théoden's perspective, he's like, look, you know, I don't want to be tempted to take it easy and to take the easy road. I'm here to do the hard thing now. And I like that it is turning back and looking at the men under his command that seems to regenerate that resolve, right? It's like, look back. No, you know, these guys are all counting on me. It's my job. You know, I'm their leader. I am the king and they're following me. And so I'm going to do this. And then he talks about how long it feels, right? You know, we've been there, man, that was just a week ago. Are you kidding me? That feels like it was, 3 months ago. It seems like a very long time ago that he rode west. And when he talks about riding west, he means west from Edoras to Helm's Deep, right? So this was not that long ago after all. But even though it feels like it's been a long time, he is determined never to lean on a staff again. He is not looking for the easy way out.
Yeah. And his argument is that if we lose, what's the point of hiding in the hills?
Right.
And if we win, then there's no grief in his death.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's a win-win.
Right.
By fighting.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, this makes me want to briefly revisit a conversation that we read in The King of the Golden Hall a couple seasons back after Théoden's initial healing by Gandalf. Gandalf says to him, "Do not delay, Théoden, when we are gone. Lead your people swiftly to the hold of Dunharrow in the hills." "Nay, Gandalf," said the king. "You do not know your own skill in healing. It shall not be so. I myself will go to war, to fall on the front of the battle if it must be. Thus shall I sleep better. Then even the defeat of Rohan will be glorious in song," said Aragorn. The armed men that stood near clashed their weapons, crying, "The Lord of the Mark will ride, forth Eorlingus!" Oh, man, I love that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, this expression, "thus shall I sleep better." And it really speaks to that whole attitude of northern courage.
Doesn't it?
The glory of song and leading his men. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Alan?
Well, the thing I'm thinking about when I think of sleep better is the fact that it's sort of an archaic way of saying things, right? This is going to give me a better death,
right?
If I do this thing. But that reminds me of this letter, and I absolutely love this because Tolkien's spot on in this. And if I pulled it up while you were discussing it briefly, it's letter 171. In 1954, a guy by the name of Hugh Brogan had written to Tolkien criticizing the narrative style of Parts of the Two Towers, especially this chapter. And he agreed with somebody else's description of it as tushery.
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 That's mere tushery.
Now, Not surprisingly, Tolkien didn't respond, probably because he knew that he was just going to shred this guy. So he just decided to be nice and remember that if you don't have anything nice to say, not say anything at all. But then Brogan writes back to him when he's a little bit older and apologizes for being impertinent, stupid. And Tolkien basically says, don't be disturbed. I've not noticed this real problem, and everybody's entitled to criticism. He explains what he's doing here with this archaic language. First, he says that the proper use of tushery is to apply it to the kind of bogus medieval stuff which attempts to give a supposed temporal color with expletives such as pish, zounds, and the like. Tolkien saying zounds is really humorous to me. But he goes on to say that a real archaic English is far more terse than modern. He goes on to talk about this exact example. And he even says, but take an example from the chapter that you specially singled out and called terrible, Book 3, The King of the Golden Hall. And he uses this exact phrase, nay, Gandalf, you don't know your own skill in healing, etc. Through thus shall I sleep better. He says, this is a fair sample, moderated or watered archaism. Using only words that still are used or known to the educated, the king would really have said, nay, thou knowest not thine own skill in healing. It shall not be so. I myself will go to war, to fall, etc. I know well enough what a modern would say. Not at all, my dear G. You don't know your own skill as a doctor. Things aren't going to be like that. I shall go to the war in person, even if I have to be one of the first casualties. And then what? Théoden would certainly think and probably say, thus shall I sleep better. But people who think like that just do not talk a modern idiom. You can have, I shall lie easier in my grave, or I should sleep sounder in my grave like that rather than if I stayed at home, if you like. But there would be an insincerity of thought, a disunion of word and meaning. For a king who spoke in a modern style would not really think in such terms at all. And any reference to sleeping quietly in the grave would be a deliberate archaism of expression on his part, far more bogus than the actual archaic English that I have used. I love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because that concept itself is archaic.
Yes.
It is not the way a modern person would speak for a very good reason. The modern person wouldn't want to do that.
Exactly.
I love it.
Tushery.
So rich. Tushery. Yes, tushery.
I can't help but think of sort of a Monty Python sketch. Here we are at the 3rd annual tushery competition, and things are looking good for the Cornish team this year. Zounds, yes, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, pish posh. That really actually would be an excellent Monty Python skit, I have to say. The tushery competition.
Anyway. So, in short, Théoden puts an end to the conversation and points it, much like Tolkien did in that letter. But Théoden puts an end to the conversation and points out that there's one last evening of peace for us. And so let us continue on to the hold of Dunharrow.
All right. Let us do that indeed. In the deepening dusk, they came down into the valley. Here the Snowborn flowed near to the western walls of the dale, and soon the path led them to a ford where the shallow waters murmured loudly on the stones. The ford was guarded. As the king approached, many men sprang up out of the shadow of the rocks, and when they saw the king, they cried with glad voices, Théoden King! Théoden King! The King of the Mark returns! Then one blew a long call on a horn. It echoed in the valley. Other horns answered it, and lights shone out across the river. And suddenly there rose a great chorus of trumpets from high above, sounding from some hollow place, as it seemed, that gathered their notes into one voice and sent it rolling and beating on the walls of stone. So the King of the Mark came back victorious out of the west to Dunharrow, beneath the feet of the White Mountains. There he found the remaining strength of his people already assembled, for as soon as his coming was known, captains rode to meet him at the ford, bearing messages from Gandalf. Dunharrow, chieftain of the folk of Harrowdale, was at their head. At dawn 3 days ago, Lord, he said, Shadowfax came like a wind out of the west to Edoras, and Gandalf brought tidings of your victory to gladden our hearts. But he brought also word from you to hasten the gathering of the riders. And then came the winged shadow. The winged shadow, said Théoden. We saw it also, but that was in the dead of night before Gandalf left us. Maybe, Lord, said Dunharrow. Yet the same or another like to it, a flying darkness in the shape of a monstrous bird, passed over Edoras that morning, and all men were shaken with fear. For it stooped upon Medgiseld, and as it came low, almost to the gable, there came a cry that stopped our hearts. Then it was that Gandalf counselled us not to assemble in the fields, but to meet you here in the valley under the mountains. And he bade us to kindle no more lights or fires than Barris need asked. So it has been done. Gandalf spoke with great authority. We trust that it is as you would wish. And we'll just stop there again because we can't read everything, unfortunately.
Yeah. So as the king and the riders approach a shallow ford over the Snowbourne, those that are already there respond with joy, right? They're shouting his name, Théoden King. The king of the Mark returns, and there's blowing horns echoing and responding.
What a moment that must be. We get this chorus of trumpets from high above, presumably from the hold itself. Recall now, though, that it's been only 6 days since the battle at Helm's Deep. So when the text talks about the king coming back victorious out of the west, that's what we're talking about here. He's only been gone a week.
And he discovers that his people are assembled at the hold in Dunharrow. His captains had come down from Dunharrow to the Vale to meet him at the ford. And with Dunharrow, their chieftain, approaching Théoden to give him news.
Exactly. And Dunharrow brings the king up to speed. Right, Gandalf arrived at dawn 3 days ago. So recall, it's now the evening of March 9th, like we talked about at the beginning. Gandalf had arrived at Edoras at sunrise on March 6th. So 3 days, but, 3 days plus. And he also brought news of Théoden's victory at Helm's Deep, so they knew he'd already won, along with Théoden's order to gather the riders, to muster the Rohirrim.
Yes. But after Gandalf arrived and brought news and orders, the Winged Shadow came.
Ooh, the Winged Shadow.
The Winged Shadow.
I love that.
Théoden mentions the Winged Shadow that they saw the night before. And so the question is, was that the same one? Dunharrow describes it as a flying darkness in the shape of a monstrous bird. Now, every man was shaken with fear, especially as it descended close to Medgiseld and let loose a monstrous cry.
Yeah. I'm thinking it's probably not the exact same one. I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter.
That doesn't make it any less scary, yes.
Yeah, it doesn't make it any less terrifying. But, remember when Pippin looked in the Palantir and then he saw a Nazgul flying towards him, like perspective-wise, it was flying right at him. And then there's a Nazgul that we see then flying over that place that they all were. We looked at that and came to the conclusion, of course, that was not the same Nazgul that he saw in the Palantir because of the distance involved. Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking maybe this is that second one, the one that he saw in the Palantir, because that first one had maybe headed over to Isengard to figure out what's up with Saruman. He's not answering his calls. He's blocked me. I can't even follow him on Twitter anymore. I don't understand. What did I do?
He's an unfriend.
Yeah. So now, not surprisingly, the arrival of the Winged Shadow, which, by the way, I love that. It does add a certain gravitas to it, doesn't it? Rather than just the Winged Shadow. Mm. The Winged Shadow is like a shadow that's had his wings clipped. He's been winged.
Yes.
As opposed to a winged shadow, right? It's just like terrifying. So the Winged Shadow's arrival leads Gandalf to give some very specific counsel that thankfully was followed. Very wise ideas. First, don't muster here in the plains where they can pick you off one at a time. Mm-hmm. Go muster in Harrowdale where you won't be as visible. And speaking of visibility, don't use any more lights or fires than you absolutely must.
Yeah.
Don't light the lights.
So Dunharrow seeks Théoden's confirmation that they did the right thing. After all, they were following Gandalf's orders, not Théoden's, and Gandalf's not the king.
Not last time I checked.
But he spoke with great authority. And of course, the advice was sound and not in conflict with the king's orders. So yes, it is well. Théoden confirms in the part that we didn't read that, that it was the right thing to do.
Right. And that's also where Théoden tells Dunharrow to get the leaders together and to have them go to Théoden at the hold, as that's where he's headed now, and that's where you're going to pick up.
On all the level spaces, there was a great concourse of men. Some thronged to the roadside, hailing the king and the riders from the west with glad cries. But stretching away into the distance behind there were ordered rows of tents and booths, and lines of picketed horses, and great store of arms, and piled spears bristling like thickets of new-planted trees. Now all the great assembly was falling into shadow, and yet, though the night chill blew cold from the heights, no lanterns glowed, no fires were lit. Watchmen, heavily cloaked, paced to and fro. Merry wondered how many riders there were. He could not guess their number in the gathering gloom, but it looked to him like a great army, many thousands strong. While he was peering from side to side, the king's party came up under the looming cliff on the eastern side of the valley, and there suddenly the path began to climb, and Merry looked up in amazement. He was on a road the like of which he had never seen before, a great work of men's hands in years beyond the reach of song. Upwards it wound, coiling like a snake, boring its way across the sheer slope of rock. Steep as a stair, it looped backwards and forwards as it climbed. Up it horses could walk, and wains could be slowly hauled, but no enemy could come that way, except out of the air, if it was defended from above. At each turn of the road, there were great standing stones that had been carved in the likeness of men, huge and clumsy-limbed, squatting cross-legged, with their stumpy arms folded on fat bellies. Some, in the wearing of years, had lost all features, save the dark holes of their eyes that still stared sadly at the passers-by. The riders hardly glanced at them. The Pukelmen, they called them, and heeded them little. No power or terror was left in them. But Merry gazed at them with wonder, and a feeling almost of pity, as they loomed up mournfully in the dusk.
What a sight. So let's go back to the part we skipped. There's a little more narrative helping us get the lay of the land here. First, the road over the ford now heads straight to the east, and we get a description of how wide the valley is here. It's only about a half a mile wide. It's 800 meters. It's not wide at all, filled with grass meadows. So really, think any narrow alpine valley, sort of the vision that we're getting here. There is a root of the Starkhorn sticking out into the vale, though.
Then we get a good look at the men of Rohan who have gathered here, according to Théoden's command and Gandalf's counsel. A great concourse of riders. And while some are near the road cheering on the king and his riders, the numbers here are vast. Rows and rows of tents, lines of horses, piled spears.
Oh, yeah. Huge numbers of horsemen here. And even though it's cold and getting dark, and even though there are thousands of men here, there are no fires per Gandalf's advice. But there are, of course, some cloaked watchmen keeping an eye on things. So really, for what? I mean, if the Nazgul come, what are the watchmen going to do? Right.
Yeah. But now we come back to Merry's perspective specifically. And he can't guess how many riders in the area, but he suspects many thousands.
Yeah, he's not far off. Many thousands is right. We know that by the time they arrive there, there's a force of 6,000 riders that reach Minas Tirith in a few days, and this would certainly be most of them.
Yeah. And as he looks over the gathering riders, they approach the face of a steep cliff, and the path begins to go up. And Merry is stunned by this steep switchback road, having never seen anything like it.
Oh, yeah. Well, he's never encountered a mountain steep enough to require it, right? This is quite a feat of engineering when you look at it. Speaking of that engineering, this isn't a recent creation, right? This isn't something that the men of Rohan built. This goes back, and I love the phrase, to years beyond the reach of song. Oh, yeah. Man. So, of course, in order to build anything up in the hold, this road would have had to have been built first. So that means this road was built before the standing stones, before the evil places and the paths of the dead were built, all of which were built before the men of Numenor even landed in this area. This is ancient.
Yeah, incredible. And
it really is.
While horses could walk up it and wagons could be hauled up, albeit slowly, the design of the road would make it impossible for an enemy to successfully come up this way if it was defended from above.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've been on mountain switchbacks. I watch the Tour de France every year, and I'm thinking of like the Alpe d'Huez, and the road just keeps going up and up and up, back and forth, back and forth. And if you look at it top down, the road, each path that goes across the mountain face is just barely ahead of the other one.
Yeah.
It's just that there's these huge steep curves at either end. And it's pretty impressive stuff. It would be very difficult to attack a place up a road like that. Because, of course, the Rohirrim would have the high ground.
Yep.
I have the high ground, Anakin. You knew that was coming. I set myself up.
You did set yourself up there.
Well, you refused, so I had to do it myself. So every time the road turns back to make another climb, Merry sees a standing stone, and not in the usual sort of obelisk or pillar shape of a standing stone, but in the shape of a man, a large, stocky man sitting with legs crossed, arms folded on fat bellies, and I'm trying not to feel called out by that description. I mean,
yeah.
Guilty as charged sometimes.
You've still got your eyeballs, right? But
yeah, that is true. That is true.
These are so old that some of them don't have any features left other than the eye holes themselves.
Yeah.
But the riders ignore them. There's no power or terror remaining in them from the point of view of the men of Rohan.
Mm.
But Merry looks at them with wonder and near pity.
Yeah, and not wrongly so. Now, the writers also give them a name. They call them the Pukul Men. Now, Sean gave us a great Philology Faire on that earlier in this episode, and we will see a lot more of them when Marcel, the Tolkienist, joins me in late February for the chapter The Ride of the Rohirrim.
Yes. Now, Hammond and Skull point us to a passage in Unfinished Tales in the section on the Druidine that's worth reading here, even though we'll probably look at it again later. We might have half an episode to spend on just that part of Unfinished Tales.
I suspect we will, when we meet Han Buri Han. Yeah.
Exactly. But in speaking of the Pukul Men, or as we know them, the Druidine, he says that they occupied the White Mountains on both sides in the First Age. When the occupation of the coastlands by the Númenóreans began in the Second Age, they survived in the mountains of the promontory of Andrast, which was never occupied by the Númenóreans. Another remnant survived at the eastern end of the range in Anorian, and that would be the Gan Buri Gan folks.
Right, exactly. Now, Tolkien goes on to say that at the end of the Third Age, the latter, much reduced in numbers, were believed to be the only survivors. Hence, the other region was called the Old Pukul Wilderness, Druwaith Iawr. It remained a wilderness and was not inhabited by men of Gondor or of Rohan, and was seldom entered by any of them. But men of the Anfalas believed that some of the old wild men still lived there secretly.
And in the part that we had to skip, as Merry looks back and down, he realizes they've quickly climbed hundreds of feet above the floor of the dale, but he still sees riders crossing the ford. And then he realizes they're going to camps in the valley floor while Théoden and his guard ascend the stairs to the hold. Yeah. And that makes some sense, right? A large group of riders ascending the switchbacks would take a very long time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if I remember correctly, he left Helm's Deep with about 500 men to bring here. And clearly, bringing 500 men single file up this would be a very long evening. So most of them will end up, mustering with the rest of the forces down in the valley. Yeah.
Okay, Alan, do you want to continue from this point?
I think I shall. At last the king's company came to a sharp brink, and the climbing road passed into a cutting between walls of rock, and so went up a short slope and out onto a wide upland. The Firienfeld men called it, a green mountain field of grass and heath, high above the deep-delved courses of the Snowbourn, laid upon the lap of the great mountains behind, the Starkhorn southwards, and northwards the saw-toothed mass of Irensaga, between which there faced the riders the grim black wall of the Dwemerberg, the haunted mountain, rising out of steep slopes of somber pines. Dividing the upland into two, there marched a double line of unshaped standing stones that dwindled into the dusk and vanished in the trees. Those who dared to follow that road came soon to the black dim holt under Dwemerberg, and the menace of the pillar of stone and the yawning shadow of the forbidden door. Such was the dark Dunharrow, the work of long-forgotten men. Their name was lost, and no song or legend remembered it. For what purpose they had made this place, as a town, or secret temple, or a tomb of kings, none in Rohan could say. Here they labored in the dark years, before ever a ship came to the western shores, or Gondor of the Dunedain was built. And now they had vanished, and only the old Pukul men were left, still sitting at the turnings of the road. Mary stared at the lines of marching stones. They were worn and black. Some were leaning, some were fallen, some cracked or broken. They looked like rows of old and hungry teeth. He wondered what they could be, and he hoped that the king was not going to follow them into the darkness beyond. Then he saw that there were clusters of tents and booths on either side of the stony way, but these were not set near the trees, and seemed rather to huddle away from them towards the brink of the cliff. The greater number were on the right, where the Firienfeld was wider, and on the left there was a smaller camp, in the midst of which stood a tall pavilion. From this side a rider now came out to meet them, and they turned from the road. Bum, bum, ba. Stay tuned in the next episode when we find out who this mysterious rider is.
Okay, so we've arrived now at the top of the switchback and found a wide alpine upland, the Firienfeld.
Ah, the Firienfeld.
Now, in the nomenclature, Tolkien points out something that you talked about back at the Beacon Hills. I won't say we, because I wasn't there.
That's fair.
That Firien is Rohan for mountain, coming from the Old English Firien with a G.
Right.
Pronounced as a palatalized because of the following front vowel.
Exactly.
For those of you following along at home.
Which should be all of you, we hope. Of course, we see this format, the Firien thing, with Halifirion, which means holy mountain, as well as Firien wood, which is the forest on the slopes of Halifirion. And then, of course, the suffix element feld is simply Old English for field, so mountain field.
Mm. And we see it now placed among the peaks of the region. This high alpine field of grass between the Starkhorn to the south and the Irrensaga to the north and the Dwimmerberg between them.
Yeah. Now, we'd mentioned the Irrensaga before when we were sort of getting the lay of the land, but a quick look at nomenclature does tell us its meaning as well, and it means iron saw, and Tolkien says that that is in reference to its serrated ridge, so, really series of sharp, knife-like peaks at the top of the Irrensaga. Now, as for the region as a whole, as for Harrowdale, Karen Wynne Fonstad has an excellent map of the area in the Atlas of Middle-earth. So if you're having a tough time sort of envisioning the valley and the layout, I'd recommend taking a look at that if you're interested.
Yeah, she did an amazing job of translating the narrative to cartographic form. Yeah.
Wonderfully done.
Always worth looking at. So we see the double line of unshaped standing stones dividing the uplands and the heading back to the trees, leading to the Dimholt and the forbidden door to the paths of the dead.
Now, we saw these stones as well in the last chapter when Aragorn and the Grey Company experienced a sense of dread as they passed between them. And in the postscript to that episode, the Prancing Pony Podcast Patreon postscript, or P5, we learned that in an earlier version of the story, we only arrived at Dunharrow with Merry and Théoden. The story of Aragorn's arrival was going to be told as a flashback, along with the entire Paths of the Dead. You know how right now we get the story of the Paths of the Dead, or the army, the Oathbreakers. We get part of that as a flashback later on. We find out what happened at Pelargir and all that. Originally, Tolkien had written that entire experience as a flashback. And so we were going to encounter the stones with Merry and Théoden right now, and we would not have seen them in the last chapter.
Yeah. So when the structure was changed, but this moment of dread was still present with Aragorn and the Rangers, it did feel a bit odd. And Christopher Tolkien himself observes this, writing, "The approach of the company to the dark door next morning is described with curious brevity. The double line of standing stones across the Firienfeld is mentioned cursorily, as if the existence were already known to the reader."
Yeah, and that's exactly why, because in a way we were supposed to have already known about them. Great stuff. So this is Dunharrow. It is a place of great significance for sure, and quite possibly a place of worship or reverence for these ancient men that are no longer remembered in song or story. And we don't really know. We know that may be what it was done for, but we don't know. Its purpose is completely unknown.
Yeah. We know only that it was built in the dark years before the Númenóreans arrived.
Yeah.
But we get a more detailed description of the rows of standing stones from Merry's perspective, of course.
Of course.
They're worn and black. Some are leaning, others fallen.
Yeah. Cracked, some of them completely broken. Interestingly, it reminds him of rows of old teeth, and all I can think of is Gollum saying, "Yes, but we has only 9 or 6. How many teeth?" It's a lot less than I've got. So while Mary is busy worrying that maybe the king is following the stones, Mary notices the groups of tents on either side of the road set back from the trees.
Right, there's a large number of tents on the right where the field is wider, but the king's pavilion's on the left, and that's where he spots a rider now coming out to meet them as they leave the road.
So I know that everybody expects that this rider is Éowyn, but I think it looks suspiciously like Bartleman. James, what does Bartleman have in the bag for us tonight?
So earlier tonight, we talked about how Mary could recognize some of the words spoken by the Rohirrim. So it seems a perfect time to bring in a question from Daniel D., who asks, how could the Westron tongue remain a standard language across such enormous space and over so much time without some unifying authority, whether political, religious, or cultural? How many centuries did it take for Latin to turn into distinct, non-mutually intelligible tongues after the fall of Rome? Less time that elapsed after Evedri went off to spend quality time with Osse? And yes, Latin survived in Europe's lingua franca until the 18th century, but that was due to the prominence of the Catholic Church, especially in academic matters. I'm curious as to your thoughts or any information that would explain the phenomenon. I can't summon my memory or the math to figure out how long it took Quenya and Sindarin to become separate languages, admittedly probably longer than 1,000 years, but clearly linguistic changes over time are important to Tolkien.
Yeah.
Alan, what do you have to say on this?
Of course you had to throw that one to me. That's a good question, Daniel. I do think, though, that it was Tolkien's intention that the unifying authority that you reference here, that's got to be the Númenórean culture. I mean, that's what would keep Westron as the lingua franca of Middle-earth. After all, despite not having a ruling monarch, or a papal equivalent for that matter, the kingdom remained pervasive enough for even the isolated hobbits to refer to wild peoples and places as having never heard of the king. So clearly a wide cultural influence. Now, the Númenórean kingdoms in exile are the closest thing Middle-earth has to a Roman Empire, and it is their fall that began the current age of decline. Now, yeah, it is true that Arvedui died about 1,000 years before the War of the Ring, and that is a lot longer than the time that it took for French and Spanish to emerge after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. Old French is the earliest attested Romance languages. That has examples going back to a little less than 400 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. Old Spanish or Old Castilian is about 100 years younger than that. So, yeah, those didn't take all that long. But the thing that I have to consider is the pace of the passage of time. Now, for this, I want to go to the letters, and there's a footnote to letter 211 where Tolkien explains that we are now at the end of the Fifth Age if the ages were of about the same length as the Second Age and Third Age. But then he says something that I think is particularly relevant here. But they, talking about the ages, they have, I think, quickened. And I imagine we are actually at the end of the Sixth Age or in the Seventh. In other words, the ages are getting shorter. And I believe Tolkien would say that the currents of time that make these changes happen in language and culture and all these other fields, those currents move faster for us now than they did back in the Third Age. James, what do you think?
So I think there's a few things worth noting here. Firstly, language change can be quite slow in more isolated communities. Icelanders can largely understand Old Norse, even if it sounds funny to them. On an Iceland air flight once, I asked for my meal in Old Norse, which I was studying.
Oh, of course you
studying
did.
at the time.
That is awesome.
But what was fascinating is the flight attendant understood exactly what I said, but laughed and said, "We don't talk like that anymore."
That's awesome. What a story.
Also remember that Merry just recognized certain words, not complete utterances, right? He couldn't put everything together. So there are many words that a modern day Romance language speaker could recognize from Latin.
That's
right?
true.
There are 3,000-year-old words in Homer that a modern Greek speaker would recognize. And think how many Italian words seem familiar if you know some French or Spanish.
That's true.
So I think it's important to distinguish how long it takes for separate languages to emerge from how long it takes for them to lose any resemblance at all in their words.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
Now, this raises the interesting question of Quenya and Sindarin, whose existence is explained by the sundering of the elves.
Right.
But I was having a conversation with my good friend Sarah Monnier just recently about this, and she pointed out that while the number of years that passed was great, the number of generations of elves was not. And that actually really stumps me, how the languages were able to separate so much, given that we're not talking about a huge number of generations.
No.
And I don't know off the top of my head if Tolkien gives some other explanation for the Quenya Sindarin split, because the generational distance certainly doesn't give time enough.
Oh, that is a really interesting catch, and you're absolutely right, or I should say that Sarah's absolutely right. Yeah. Given the fact that an elven generation is roughly, 3 to 4 times that of a human generation because of how old they typically are when they start to have children.
Most of the original speakers were still around. It's not even
goodness.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. How would a language die out or become that radically different if the original speakers are still there?
Galadriel's still around to remind us how it was spoken in Valinor. So, it's a really, really interesting question.
Oh, man. Wow. No, I don't have any. Ooh. I see that as being a subject for a later discussion.
Yes.
That's actually something I should probably get Sean involved in, see if he might be able to help us out.
So, do we have time for one more, Alan?
I believe we do. It's an interesting one. Kirsten E. has a question that actually isn't really for us, though we'll answer it ourselves as well. The question is, how are your listeners scheduling their Lord of the Rings readings these days? I read it, she says, usually along with The Hobbit and the Silmarillion every year around wintertime. I know plenty of others do the same. Christopher Lee did too. But it's also fun to read in conjunction with your podcast schedule, which would, however, be very different from doing it once yearly. Are some people rearranging their reading routine, keeping it the same but also reading the chapter that goes with the week's episode, listening to the podcast instead of reading? It would be so interesting to know.
Yeah.
You're right, Kirsten. It would be very interesting to know.
Yeah, it would. I mean, as you said, Alan, it's we literally can't answer that because the question lies with our listeners, and I'm keen to hear what they say. But I mean, we can talk about our own readings, so let's do that. This year was an unusual one for me in that for various teaching reasons, and I don't know, some TV show that was on.
Maybe
I ended up reading the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales multiple times in place of Lord of the Rings. And with my History of Middle-earth classes coming up next year, I don't see that changing for the next 6 months. I think my reading schedule's a little different at the moment. Alan, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not going to be surprising that for me, the podcast really dictates my reading plan. I used to read The Lord of the Rings every year. I certainly would read The Silmarillion every year. The Hobbit sometimes not. But now what I try to do is read the entirety of The Lord of the Rings in the hiatus that I have each year between seasons. It's not a very long hiatus, but I try to read the entirety of it in order to put the coming season into perspective and to sort of spot the way the themes continue from book to book. Connections, discussion points, everything else that I want to bring up over the next 40 plus discussion episodes. Now, I wish I had the time to add The Hobbit and the Silmarillion to that, especially the Silmarillion, which I miss immensely. But even though we usually take 6 weeks off for hiatus, I'm only off for about 3 of those. So I just don't have the time to tackle much more. But I admit my plan is almost certainly a bit of an outlier. So folks, we invite you to reach out to us at Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com and let us know what your reading plans are for the Legendarium.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what the variety of approaches is amongst I'll be very amongst curious. Our community. Yeah,
indeed. Well, that is all that we have time for this week, folks. It wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. But be sure to join us again next week when Éowyn is grieved, we learn more about the paths of the dead, and the Red Arrow arrives.
Ooh, the Red Arrow.
The Red Arrow. Which means don't turn left. Don't turn left right now. That's what it means, right?
Well, yes, that's right.
You want to wait for the green arrow.
Yeah, exactly. Wait for the green arrow. Exactly. Dear me. Folks, Alan and I want to thank the members of Team PPP, Editor Jordan Rennells, Barliman Becca Davis, along with our team of research assistants, social media manager Casey Hilsey, event and Patreon community coordinator Katie McKenna, graphic artist Megan Collins, and website guru Phil Dean.
Now, speaking of the website, please, folks, be sure to give us a visit there at the newly redesigned theprancingponypodcast.com. We've got show notes, hilarious outtakes, Prancing Pony ponderings, and our online storefront where you can get all sorts of PPP merch.
You'll also want to visit our library page. The Prancing Pony Podcast is, first and foremost, a podcast about the books. So if you're interested in a book we've mentioned on the show, you'll find a link for it in our library. The PPP gets a small amount of compensation when you make your purchase, and we thank you for that.
Indeed we do. And you may also want to go ahead and pre-order Why We Love Middle-earth, coming out in September of 23, written by Sean Marchese and myself. So the links are available there at the website. In the meantime, we also want to thank our patrons at the Kierdance contribution tier. I want to start with DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Paul in Colorado, Jerry in Texas, B in California, Joseph in Texas, Kathy from North Carolina, Lori from Washington, Carlos in California, Brian in the UK, Ned from Connecticut, Jerry from Washington, Joe in Washington, and Erwin from the Netherlands.
There's also Dylan in Australia, Ben in Minnesota, Anthony in Texas, Karen in the UK, Zaksu in Illinois, Jim in Maryland, Brian in Texas, Sarah in New Jersey, June in Ireland, Joshua in Massachusetts, James in Florida, Lucy in Texas, Connor in North Carolina, Keith in Alabama, Carson in Oklahoma, Vivian in California, and James in Massachusetts. Thank you all so very much for your support.
Indeed, thank you very, very much.
Now make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe now through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your reading plans for the Legendarium to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. And if you want your voice literally heard, well, just send us audio of your question. You can visit podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your question for us.
Please be sure to still email the question to Barliman. Even though Barliman's been a lot more reliable lately, there's still a lot of mail to sort through. We'll try to get to you as soon as we're able.
As always, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time,
fare you well while you may. Go with the goodwill of all good men.